Is the world. Paul Connew, welcome to Talking Pints. Now, you go back to the days when it actually was Fleet Street.
Yes, indeed. In fact, and the days when Boris Johnson was a young Brussels reporter. In fact, and Boris and I. Should we say, I am not an admirer of Boris Johnson, as a new book I'm one of the authors of out this week, in fact, shows Boris Johnson. Media creation, media clown, and media casualty, with a question mark. And I think the image on the front of this book, which I think you've got somewhere, will,
it's on the screen,
will actually contrast with Boris's photo op today in Kyiv. Now, actually, in a recent book we did back in June, in fact, reporting the Ukraine war, for once I did praise Boris, because I think he has been at the front, of the European effort in support, of Ukraine.
They fell in behind him, effectively.
Yes. Although I think the Ukrainian media have kindly overlooked something that Boris said, which you may well remember. In the 2016 referendum campaign, Boris mitigated for Putin over the 2014 annexation of Crimea, partly blaming the EU for it. But I think people have conveniently forgotten that. Well, he does his faux Churchillian rhetoric now. But he has been right, on Ukraine.
As a journalist, Boris Johnson wrote very entertaining columns for the Daily Telegraph. They were popular in the newspaper. He went on, of course, to become the editor of The Spectator, one of the oldest political magazines in existence.
Although his old boss, Andrew Neil, thinks very little of him now, and compares him to Donald Trump, in fact, recently.
And we will come to Trump in a moment. And we will, I promise. But he actually was, whether you like him or not, he was a successful journalist.
He was. But although he was a man who didn't... A witty phrase was often carried more with Boris than accuracy and truth, and remember things like pickaninnies and and bum boys, or bum bag boys, in fact, etc. Now,
but you know what? He was writing for. He was as much an entertainer in print as he was a news journalist, wasn't he?
But one of the problems is if you put a journalist / entertainer into Downing Street, it hasn't worked.
I've been a sceptic. And people who watch and listen to this show thought I was being highly critical, but I made the point 8 months ago that he wouldn't survive as Prime Minister. I could see this series of disasters and catastrophes coming. And yet, the truth of it is, Boris will be off to America within a few days of giving up the premiership, and he'll make loads of money, won't he?
He will do, although I still suspect he wants to be a player and an influencer in British politics. And in a sense, Liz Truss, who almost certainly is going to be following him into number 10, is the continuity Boris candidate.
I'm not sure she's continuity. I don't think.
Yes.
I mean, she shoots from the hip in terms of what she says more than Boris Johnson.
Yeah, one anecdote in the book, which dates back to 1990 for me, was when I was a young senior executive on the News of the World. Boris was the thrusting young Brussels correspondent of the Daily Telegraph. We were investigating his old Etonian chum, Darius Guppy, involved in a major fraud scandal, and Boris was asked by Guppy to get hold of the reporter involved's address so Guppy could send round a couple of heavies to beat him up. Boris, in fact, far from being horrified by this, was relieved when he was told he'd probably only get a sort of, a cracked rib or two. But that showed the sort of thinking of Boris Johnson. His editor at the time was, of course, now Sir Max Hastings, and who is now one of the strongest critics of Boris you can imagine. But he only censored Boris and gave him a ticking off. I often wonder now if Sir Max doesn't wonder if he'd given Boris the order of the boot, history may have been changed for the better.
And history is full of these sort of things, isn't it? Now, you mentioned Donald Trump a moment ago, and I know that you worked in America in print for British newspapers, but working in America, 70s, 80s, and came across the Donald.
The Donald, yeah. Before he was toying with politics at the time, but not really addressing it. At the time, I knew him quite well. His aspirations were to oust Don King as the biggest boxing promoter in the world, and to run the biggest casino empire in the world, which didn't end very well, of course, on either front.
How did you find him?
I found him entertaining, but also chilling. Completely self-obsessed, but you've got to know him more recently, and also, if you told me that one day he would become the most powerful figure in the world as President of the United States, I'd have summoned men in white coats to come and take you away. So it's quite extraordinary, and the danger is, it's not out of the question, provided he's not in jail, which he deserves to be, in my view. But in fact,
no.
But in fact, he could well return.
Well, I think he may well do, because the Democrats are in one hell of a mess. They're in one hell of a mess. They've got a leader that shouldn't be there, a deputy who's even more unpopular than the leader that shouldn't be there, no other obvious candidate. And actually, when you look at American cities, and we've got some lawlessness happening in our country, but goodness me.
But not on the scale of the insurrection at Capitol Hill, for which...
Well, hang on a second. American cities were ablaze after the George Floyd incident, and by defunding the police in those departments, we've seen huge rises in homicide and everything else. So there is serious fault on both sides in these American cities, isn't there?
Well, there are huge problems, but I think for a U.S. president to behave as he did, leading up and effectively inciting what happened on Capitol Hill, I think is chilling.
He said, go in peace. I mean, you listen to what he said. He said, go in peace.
You look at the evidence being given by some of his former aides to the congressional inquiry.
Amazing stuff, like he tried to take control of the steering wheel. I mean, they're lies, aren't they? They're lies. They're nonsense.
You have more faith in him than I do, Nigel.
I think it was an ugly incident. It's a horrible thing.
I remember you being on the platform during his campaign against Hillary Clinton.
Yeah.
Can you see him wanted to have another Brit, Boris Johnson, on the platforms with him? I don't think Boris would.
No.
I think that's one courtship that Boris would actually not want to consummate.
I don't think he'd want Boris there, because I think he wouldn't think Boris was a conservative, and he's not really, is he? I mean,
he did famously or infamously what called Boris the Brit Trump, of course.
That was on day one. I was there. I was in the audience that day. Actually, it was an event that took place. It was in Washington, D.C. It was a big turning point students' event. And he called him that for a little bit, but not for very long.
But Andrew Neil, quite interestingly, compares Boris's reluctance to leave Number 10. Let's not forget it, in that rather pathetic resignation speech, from which he didn't even mention the R word. But his resentment at leaving has certain echoes of Trump refusing to
That may be true, it may not. Paul, the way we get our news, the way we get our opinions, the way we form our own opinions, the way we, around a beer, debate things that we agree on, and you and I disagree on loads of stuff, but we can do it in a very civil...
Especially on Brexit.
Yeah, no, we'll come to that. But here's the point. Your days at News of the World, by the way, folks, well pre any hacking, so we get that in. Yes. And your days at the Mirror, and the newspapers were hugely powerful, and there were only a couple of television channels, and now we've got online media, increasingly growing. Do traditional media organisations survive the next 5 or 10 years with the online world?
A big challenge, and one of the factors you're finding now is that there used to be a clear dividing line between news and comment. You could have a ferocious partisan leader, or one of your columnists would be writing, a very opinionated column. But at times, and this is happening a lot around the Boris Johnson situation now, where pro-Boris newspapers are using terms like kangaroo court with regard to the Privileges Committee investigation, not in quotes, but
do we consume that? Do we consume that by buying the newspaper or by looking at it online? And if we're doing it online, what's to stop new competitors coming in?
There isn't, in fact, and I think we've got a lot of issues about. I mean, I'm both a strong critic of social media, while also being a strong supporter of it. And we did another book a couple of years ago called Anti-Social Media with a question mark. And although I still think social media's positives outweigh its negatives, the negatives are very dangerous. And you were talking earlier on, about crime and violence, and when you look at the knife incidents, you look at what you can buy. You can buy a machete online. You can buy the most lethal knives online. At least we can't, not Americans, you can't actually, in the UK, as far as I can see, you can't buy a submachine gun, in fact, online.
Not legally, but illegally.
Yeah.
And look at Liverpool a couple of days ago.
Yeah, and it's, and the Liverpool scenario was absolutely chilling.
So it is a very difficult, very flexible world in terms of where we're going to go with media, social media. Are the great giants going to survive? But I have to ask you this. When the Jimmy Savile case burst into full public view, people were shocked, horrified. I mean, I think we thought he was a bit weird, but did some wonderful show. I mean, you know how he was really hailed as being this extraordinary figure. Well, now, you were one of the journalists who was sort of on his case a few years earlier.
I was the editor of the Sunday Mirror back in '94 when we came very close to being. We were legally thwarted in the end, very close to exposing Jimmy Savile. And
how close?
We had two very, very good victim witnesses. And the only reason in the end that we couldn't publish was because one lost her nerve, not because she changed her story, but she said to me memorably, who's going to believe me? I'm a girl. I mean, by this stage she was a woman with children. Who's going to believe me, an approved schoolgirl, when Jimmy Savile, and I remember this verbatim, his remarks, when Jimmy Savile is a friend of Prince Charles and Princess Diana and gets invited by Margaret Thatcher to Chequers for Christmas. And her husband didn't want her to actually, because the children didn't know that she'd once been an approved schoolgirl.
Lot to put yourself through as well.
And her friend then didn't want to go on her own. And every editor, every reporter has, the one that got away, the one that they feel bitter or even ashamed of to a certain extent that you didn't, you weren't able to chat.
You got very close. Paul, couple of minutes left. Final thoughts. You were against Brexit, but you read Brexit. You read it very, very well. You knew it would happen. You also understood that the Boris majority was very much. It wasn't just about Brexit. Corbyn was a real turn-off, and you've been a Labour supporter, but you couldn't support them under Corbyn.
I didn't. I left Labour temporarily up with Corbyn, and I predicted that Leave would win the referendum. After doing my own, DIY rough and ready research in the red wall areas that I thought would be decisive. Although it was rough and ready, it turned out to be more accurate than the big pollsters. But I went back to the same research database, to the same people, after the 2019 landslide for Boris, and it turned out that Boris wasn't particularly loved, quite the reverse. And quite a lot of people said they didn't support Boris, but they held Corbyn in greater contempt.
Yes.
And that, along with Get Brexit Done, but Get Brexit Done hasn't been done. Boris has got it technically across the line. But Brexit is, as the polls are now showing, whether you're a Leaver or a Remainer, Brexit isn't working.
It's unfinished business
And in the book, I suggest that Keir Starmer would be better off nicking the old Saatchi and Saatchi slogan for Maggie Thatcher back in 78 and 79, where he said Labour isn't working. It should be Brexit isn't working, with a picture of Boris Johnson, William Rees-Mogg.
I tell you what, Paul Connew.
Probably not you, Nigel, because unlike Boris,
I was honest about it.
people close to Boris, including members of his family, will tell you privately that he was never really a Brexiteer. It was the way he saw the passport to fulfilling his prime ministerial
This is the pub
dream.
conversation that would only end by last orders and being chucked out.
No.
I have to call time, Paul Connew.
Cheers.